All right, well, welcome back to Begin with the Basics. We just finished chapter 2 of Genesis with the creation of Eve and the institution of marriage. Now we're getting to the sad chapter. We're going to get to Genesis 3. Now, before we get into that, just real quick again, if you have any questions, you want to let me know about any of the things that I've talked about, feel free to let me know. I'll try and answer them. If I get enough questions, I'll just do an entire session on just questions people have. If not, I'll try and answer them as I go along. So we're going to be jumping into chapter 3. And again, chapter 3 is on the fall of man. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the world before that. Because we've talked about creation. I just want to kind of illustrate, think through some of the things that would be happening in this world. Because this is the world as it was meant to be. This is the world that Adam and Eve were inhabiting before the fall. And actually, before we get to that, the first thing I want to ask is a question people always ask about how much time passed since creation week to the temptation. It's a good question. How much time actually passed? We're not actually sure exactly how much time, but there are some upper and lower bounds that we can establish here. First of all, the maximum upper bound would be, it'd have to be less than 130 years. If you look at Genesis 5 through the genealogy there, Adam fathered Seth at 130 years old. And we know that there would have been enough time for Adam and Eve to have Cain and Abel, for them to grow old enough to work, for Cain to murder Abel, and then for Seth to be born. Now, it looks like Seth was probably their next child born after Cain murdered Abel. But still, that's probably at the upper bound, would probably be about 100, 110 years after creation. But most likely, it's actually probably far less than that. That's just the maximum upper bound we have. On the other end, the minimum time, there would have to have been at least enough time for Satan to fall and to come up with a plan to deceive Eve. We know that on the sixth day, it was all very good, and we know that angels are part of creation. So Satan would have to have fallen after the sixth day. How long would it take for an angel to grow prideful and resentful and to deceive a third of the other angels? We don't know, but weeks probably, maybe less, but probably weeks. Now, other considerations I've heard for the time is that Adam and Eve did not have any kids before the fall. It wasn't until after the fall that Eve got pregnant with Cain. So some people argue it couldn't have been too long. And if they combine that with the command to fill the world and subdue it, so that seems to suggest that they would have wanted to have kids as soon as possible. Now, the one criticism I have to this is that we don't know if their biological cycles were the same as ours, like pre-fall versus post-fall. If they were living forever, they wouldn't have to have a ton of kids immediately to obey the commandment to fill the world. It would happen. So we actually don't know, like, if they, how fast their biological cycles would have been before the fall. Now, another argument for the fall being much sooner than 100 years, so this is again on the, saying it's much less than 100 years, would be that after Cain's sin, he was afraid to wander the earth because someone might find him and kill him. So that would imply that there was enough time from the fall, because again, Eve did not get pregnant until after the fall. So there's enough time from the fall to a sin for there to be enough people around for him to worry about running into other people. Now, we'll talk about this a little more when we get to Cain and Abel. But for there to be enough people around would probably take at least 70 to 80 years. So again, that would push the date even closer, like at the most 30 years from creation to the fall. So 30 years, or maybe 40 or 50 years at the most, but probably, again, less than that. So again, how soon? Well, again, days or weeks at minimum. Could have been several years, but probably actually would have been 10 to 20 years at maximum. Personally, my opinion is I think it's a short period of time, month or two at best, but again, not 100% sure. But what I base that on is actually Eve's response to the snake, where she doesn't recall God's command perfectly. And we don't know if God actually gave her the command directly. It was probably actually Adam who reiterated it for her. But you would think that with the tree of knowledge of good and evil being so prominent and important in the garden, that if there were long periods of time, there would have been multiple discussions between Adam and Eve and God himself about God's commandments for it. So again, my opinion, a couple of months at the maximum, but we actually don't know. Again, I'd probably say absolute maximum would be about 20 years. Yeah. So that's the first question. How long did it take? Secondly, what was this world like? Now, again, we talked a bit about this with creation, but we've talked about it more in terms of creation. After creation week ceased, what would this be like? Well, we know, again, that God said on day 6 that it was very good. Now, the idea of very good isn't just morality, but the idea of completeness. So this would have been a complete world. Now, it's not complete in the sense we think it today, because completeness doesn't mean unchanging. It just means it has all, in a sense, the parts needed to be a world that could support man, which again is God's pinnacle creation. So it could still change, because obviously Adam and Eve still needed to fill the world, but it was complete in the sense it had all the parts in place to do what God desired. What else about this world? It was pre-fall, so there was no death, no decay, no sickness or pain. And again, one of the objections that people say about this is, well, what did the animals eat if there was no death? We discussed this in an earlier lesson, but the idea is that plants, biblically, are not alive in the same sense as animals. Biblically, blood is what represented life. And we looked at this, but again, after the flood, God told Noah he can eat living things. And not that they probably still ate them before the flood, but pre-fall, it was just plants. Now he says living things. And so in Genesis 9, 3 and 4, he says, "But every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is its blood." So again, life was associated with blood and the idea of flesh. And so plants weren't considered alive. So biblically, plants were not alive in the sense where if we eat them, that brings death into the world. So during this time, yes, they were commanded to eat from all the trees in the garden, except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that didn't bring death because that was part of God's plan. Now, another question, a little more technical question that I often hear asked, is the question of the law, the second law of thermodynamics. Was that actually in play? Now, I don't know if you've studied the second law of thermodynamics, you probably remember it from somewhere in grade school. The second law states that all closed systems will tend towards disorder and entropy. So if we have this nice ordered system and we just leave it alone, it will tend towards decay, towards disorder, towards entropy. What these systems need is an outside energy source to help them maintain order of some sort. And since it's associated with the idea of decay and disorder, many take this as a reason for why the second law of thermodynamics should not have been in effect at this time. However, if we actually think about the biological processes, the second law of thermodynamics is why we actually need to eat in the first place. Okay, if our bodies, as a system, didn't tend towards disorder, we wouldn't need some external source to reorder it. We could just internally recycle everything. So, in fact, if we were to actually remove the second law of thermodynamics from the universe, eating in those days wouldn't be anything like eating today. Like the whole process would be just foreign to us. Because the plants, you take the sun and grow, and then we eat them, and we break them down in order that we can use them. Again, that breaking down is part of that second law of thermodynamics. So probably the second law of thermodynamics was already there. But what likely has happened is that there was another law or another process of some sort that was in place as well. Okay? So again, when we talk about thermodynamics and disorder, what it means is that we get these processes and then there's this waste energy. Sometimes it's heat energy, but some sort of waste energy that we can no longer use. Now, energy can't be created or destroyed, but it changes forms. And so the second law of thermodynamics says it changes into a form where we can't use it. It's still there technically, we just can't use it. And so it's waste energy. And if you've, I don't know if any of you are, look at astronomy or cosmological theories, you may have heard of the term the heat death of the universe. This is the point where the second law of thermodynamics has gone on long enough where all the energy has been turned into waste energy, and so it can't be used anymore. Now, that would be our natural course now in this fallen world. It would be beyond billions, trillions, or even quadrillions years from now. It would be way in the future. But the thing is, if we're talking about that entropy again, the pre-fall universe was built for eternity. So it's way longer than quadrillions of years as well. So now, however long in the future we look at this heat death of the universe, we would eventually get to it in eternity. Now, our world isn't going to get there because the Lord will return before then, don't get me wrong. But if we're looking at the pre-fall world where the Lord didn't have to return, there have to have been some process designed to counter this entropy. Now, two options really. It was either a law of the universe that God retracted when God cursed creation, or that it's just a process God himself sustained and then ceased sustaining at the fall. And actually, I hold to the second view, and there's a couple of reasons why. There's some verses. If you look at, there's two verses we're going to look at. Colossians 1, 16 and 17, and then we're going to look at Hebrews 1, 3. So they're both talking about Jesus. And so Colossians 1, 16 and 17 says, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Now that phrase, all things hold together, it's talking about all of creation. It's not just talking about, your life, he has it in his hands, which he does. But he's talking about creation itself, all these things, all things he holds together. Hebrews 1:3 essentially says the same thing. Again, this is still talking about Jesus. It says, "He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power." So these two verses imply that even today, there are things that are happening because God is constantly enforcing them. Technically Jesus, but Jesus, the Son, God the Son. And if we think about how easy would it be for the one who created this world to gather the disorder and reorder it again for us to use later. Wouldn't be hard at all. So the universe was probably, before pre-fall, was probably subject to the same laws as we have now, but had some sort of additional process that would sustain it even better than today. And again, whether those were natural laws or just God himself directly doing it, we can't know. But we do know that the universe was originally designed to last forever, like man was. Now lastly, I'm going to add this in because this is something that I find interesting myself, intriguing, because I do like space. Lastly, I want to talk about the ideas of the stars themselves in a pre-fallen world. I mean, I know for myself, still love going outside, especially if you can find a nice dark patch, which is tough these days, or nice dark area, and look up at the stars and see them so bright. And when we look at them, there are planets, there are places in the universe, other planets besides Earth. And the thing is, in a pre-fallen world, in an eternal universe, those stars are closer, far more attainable. I mean, right now, there's no way we can get to them. Under the fastest space travel today, it would take over 70,000 years to reach the nearest star. And even if we got faster, it would still most likely take generations for us to get to the nearest star. So that's unattainable for us, but it's a blink of an eye in eternity. So perhaps, this is my conjecture really, perhaps those stars would have been open for us, if we were in an eternal world, as we could explore all of God's entire universe. So I just like that. Okay, so that's setting us up. That's the world we're in. People often ask, what was the world like pre-fall? And it's pretty interesting, pretty cool. And the other thing I just want to add to that is it's going to be similar, but not exactly like the new heavens and the new earth. There are going to be differences. I mean, just from the fact that we actually know good and evil. We don't need a tree of the knowledge of it anymore. But they will be very similar. So we'll see how, one day we will actually kind of see how Eden was. Okay, so we're going to get into Genesis 3 finally. So we're going to start talking about the serpent. Okay, so let's look at Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" All right, so first of all, most important question here. Who is the serpent? What is the serpent actually? Sometimes we ask, was the serpent actually a snake? We use the term serpent instead of snake. Is there actually a reason? And it's actually not really. The word there is snake. We just have gotten used to the fancy word for serpent in our translations. But everywhere else that this term is used, it's really used for a literal, real creature, the creature that we know today. For instance, I just picked a couple verses here. Amos 5:19. And it says, "As if a man did not flee from a lion and a bear met him, or he went into a house and leaned his hand against the wall and a serpent bit him." So we're talking about real creatures there, and it's the same word that's used in Genesis. Ecclesiastes 10:8. "He that digs a pit shall fall in it, and who breaketh a hedge, a serpent shall bite him." So again, talking about real circumstances, a real creature here. So sometimes we view this as more of like a figurative creature or more mythological, like a dragon or something. But no, everywhere we see the word serpent, it's talking about a literal thing. The bronze serpent in the desert was also the same word. Okay, so it's an actual, that was a image of one. They made it, but it's still the same idea. As was the word for the Moses' and Aaron's staffs when they are tossed to the ground and they become a serpent. It's the same word there. So this is an actual snake, but there is one little thing there. We do know that the snake itself was cursed. Okay, if we look at later in chapter 3, Genesis 3, verse 14, we'll see that after the first sin, the serpent was cursed to crawl in its belly. So if we look at Genesis 3:14, it says, "The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat all the days of your life." So it implies that the snake didn't crawl in its belly at some point, or didn't always crawl in its belly at least. And the crazy thing is, if we actually look at modern snakes, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, I think it was the boas and pythons specifically, they have these little dots or protrusions where their arms and their legs should actually come out. Some are pronounced enough to be called pelvic spurs. Those are the leg ones. I couldn't find a name for the little arm ones. But they do have these little spots where limbs could theoretically grow. And they technically have the gene for limb growth. Like there's a gene that's found in all creatures that have limbs. It's found in snakes, but it's never expressed. So most likely that this snake wasn't exactly like the snakes we see today. just didn't crawl on the ground, but still had limbs. It had limbs to move like it used to. It probably still has the characteristically long body, could slither, but could perform other tasks as well. So it was a snake, but not exactly like we see it today, not exactly like we see it in the pictures of Adam and Eve and the temptation, those pictures. We have the snake in the tree. It's probably not exactly like that. So secondly, was the snake actually Satan? Okay. There's some people who say that this was not actually Satan, that they say it was just a snake. Some point to the fact that Eve was not surprised to hear it talk. That was just a generic creature who is smart and wise enough to talk and reason with Eve. So was it actually Satan? Well, first of all, why wasn't Eve surprised? Again, if this was early enough in creation, just a few weeks or months in, she wouldn't have met all the creatures. Finding one that talked might seem out of place, but in the wonderful creations that she's been in, she might not find it that out of place. The other option I've heard is that pre-fall, some animals may have been designed to actually be able to communicate with humans with speech. They wouldn't have been able to hold conversations because of their intelligence, but we know that animals nowadays communicate with their sounds. If God had allowed them to communicate with humans, using human words, we could have, if your dog could respond and say that he heard you, that'd be pretty cool, as opposed to just barking. So that's another option people propose. We don't know. There are some animals that are actually fairly close to being able to speak with human speech, but none that are capable nowadays. So that could have been a product of the fall. Or again, it could have been just Eve not seeing a ton of creation, not knowing everything, and just saying, no, this is a cool creature here. So, okay, so that's why her not being surprised isn't that big of a deal. But again, was this really Satan? After all, again, it doesn't use the word Satan or devil or demon or angel or possession or anything like that. All it really says is that the serpent was crafty, okay? And the best answer here is the idea of progressive revelation. There's nothing in the story here that we need to know that it's exactly Satan for Adam and Eve to understand what went on. But progressive revelation, the Bible does expand and, in a sense, comment on itself later on. So it might not have been important for Adam and Eve to know that was a spirit, or maybe they knew, but they didn't feel it was important to write down. But the fact that, again, spirits aren't mentioned here doesn't mean that it wasn't a possession. Again, the Bible is not contradictory, but again, it just progresses with itself and comments on itself. So, was it Satan? Yes. And how do we know? Okay, first of all, there's actually a clue again later on in this chapter, verse 15, 3:15. This is the first clue that this is not just a generic snake. Okay, it says in Genesis 3:15, this is God cursing the snake still. He says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So here's the thing. It says, her offspring shall bruise his head, and he shall bruise the offspring's heel. Now, God specifically mentions the offspring of the woman, but for the serpent, it's the serpent itself that will encounter this. So what's going on here is, again, this idea of there's a creature, a being in the serpent that will encounter this. And we'll get to this in another lesson, but again, this verse here, Genesis 3:15, is actually a reference to Christ. He is the offspring that's going to bruise the serpent's head, and the serpent will bruise Christ's heel. Okay, so it bruises Christ's heel to death, but it's not permanent, but Christ will bruise the snake's head, which is a much more important body part. And actually, when I was looking at this, the word bruise is actually a weak translation of the word. It usually means like break or crush. So the snake might break the offspring's heel, but the snake's head itself will be broken. Okay, and again, talking about Jesus' victory over Satan's power of sin and death. But how else do we know? Okay, that's one verse. What else do we know? In Revelations, in 2 spots where it talks about Satan, it talks about being the serpent of old. Okay, and again, even in the Greek, the word serpent is just a fancy way of saying snake. It's snake in the Greek. We just translated serpent. So again, it says 2 times, it basically says the great dragon, which was Satan, was that ancient serpent. Okay, again, Revelations 12:9 and Revelations 20, verse 2, it talks about that. And there's other passages that talk about a spiritual factor going on in the garden in Eden during this. There's 2 Old Testament passages we're going to look at and 1 New Testament one. Ezekiel 28. Now there's 2 passages. One's Ezekiel 28, the other is Isaiah 14. Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 are interesting because they're God talking to like a king or a group of people, but then in its message there's these implications of something beyond going on. So Ezekiel 28, I'm going to read verse 13 through 15. It says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God." And this one's talking to the king of Tyre, which is an Old Testament kingdom. It says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, sardonyx, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle. And crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were in the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you." So this is an interesting passage because it's like, why would we be talking about a worldly king like this? Why would we say he is in the Garden of Eden, that he was a guardian cherub, that he was blameless until unrighteousness was found in him? Well, what's most likely is the king was actually being possessed by Satan at this time. So that would make sense that God's address was not just to the physical king, but to the spiritual being that was in possession of him as well, and the spiritual being that fancied itself to be king of the earth. So again, this being was in Eden, and he was called a guardian cherub. And by the way, if you don't know the term cherub, it's just another word for angel, and it's often associated with protection or guarding. It's not the cute little pictures you see of the Renaissance. These were actually fierce beings, even more powerful than your average angel. Now, we're going to look at Isaiah 14 just a sec. Another passage real quick is in John 8. This is Jesus himself speaking, verse 44, and it implies that Satan was there in the garden from the beginning. He doesn't actually mention Eden itself, but let's read the verse. It says, John 8:44. It says, "You are of your father the devil." He's talking to some Pharisees. Your will is to do your father's desires. "He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So the father of lies implies that he was the first liar. And so again, this is implying he was there in the garden doing the temptation. Okay, now Isaiah 14, this is the last passage we're going to take a look at. This is again another passage where God is addressing a human nation. In this case, it's the entire nation, not just a king. But sometimes you address the nation, you kind of switch to a specific person. But it's talking about Babylon. But it has, again, references in it that seem to be talking about a spiritual being. And by the way, this is the only reference to the word Lucifer in the entire Bible, which means light bringer or day star. And actually, in the ESV, the version I use, it's actually translated as day star. So this is Isaiah 14, 12 through 15. It says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low." Again, this is addressed to Babylon, so it's kind of interesting. "You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit in the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend high above the high clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, into the far reaches of the pit." So, and again, we know from New Testament that spirits can possess people and animals. Okay, Jesus cast out the spirits from a man into a herd of pigs. So it's easy to imagine Satan himself possessed the spirit. Okay, he dared not present himself. He wanted to be more subtle than that, so he chose the crafty creature to be his voice. So, now, what does this mean? So, Satan, again, was an angel. Okay, a cherub was a kind of angel. He would have been created with the rest of creation, and he would have had time to grow prideful and fall. And then to formulate a plan to try and mar or wreck the rest of God's creation. We don't know what actually caused the pride. There's two big ideas that I've heard about. First was that he was actually a pantheist. And again, what that means is that he thinks all things were kind of created equally. Like he was created, Satan was created, but maybe he thought God was created at the same time. It just God was slightly more powerful. So he thought that maybe he could, that him and God and all these angels were created in, this cosmic event. And maybe he thought because of that he could displace God. The other thoughts I've heard is that he was upset that it was man who was created in God's image and not the angels. And he thought that he was better than man, so that made him grow prideful. And we don't know exactly, but both of those actually fit with his pride. Okay? Isaiah 14, again, it says that he said in his heart he would ascend to heaven above the stars of God and set his throne on high, and that he'll make himself like the Most High. Okay? Believing that God was just another created being, or believing that man got a place that Satan believed is where he should be, both fit that idea. Okay, so we're almost done for today. We're going to just ask one last question before we're done. Okay, so the question is this: why did Satan's sin not bring about the curse, but man's sins did? Okay, so we established this is Satan. That's what the Bible says about this. But why did his sin, which must have happened earlier, not bring about the curse? Okay, there's already if Satan sinned, there's already sin and evil in God's creation. So why didn't that institute death and the curse? Well, it's a fairly simple answer. There's two reasons. One, Satan was a being of spirit, and so while we know that angels can manifest themselves physically, they are primarily spirit. And a spiritual being falling has little direct impact on the physical world. Will have indirect impact, obviously, as Satan was the tempter, but there's no reason that for the spiritual being to fall, for that to affect the physical world. And two, Satan was not steward of this world. Man was. Adam was, specifically. So Satan's fall doesn't mean anything for this world. And interestingly, we're going to see that it was actually Adam's sin, not Eve's, that brought about the curse. It brought about, again, curse, the pain and death and all that. The curse for Eve was just for herself and for women. But the curse for man was about the entire world, which he was steward over. And again, New Testament reinforces this. Romans 5, if you read just verse 12 through 21, I'm not going to read it all here, but it says that it was by one man sin entered the world. And it specifically mentions Adam there too. So Adam was this world's steward. He's the one who messed up. And so that's what affected the world around him. So again, Satan's sin wouldn't have affected our physical universe. It's only man's sin, because we were a steward over it, that would actually affect it. Okay, so we're going to end there for this week. We got through one verse. Nice. Okay, it was important though. Some good theological questions to address, and some interesting ones as well about how the world was before. Okay, so next week, or next time, we'll hopefully get to temptation. We'll get to the temptation. Hopefully we'll get to the fall and the curse itself. We'll see. So again, I do want to inform you guys that I'm going to be starting up school, teaching again, starting next week. Depending on how time intensive it is and other factors as well, I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing this every week, but hopefully at least every other week. I'm planning on keeping up with it as best as I can, but this was originally going to be just a summer Bible study, and I went a little slower through things than I expected. Well, slower than I hoped, right? Not slower than I expected. So we'll see. Again, I do plan on keeping this up at least periodically, and we'll go from there. So, all right. Have a good week. I'll see you later.